Good morning. My name is Daniel Thomas. I'm the Chief Business Correspondent or Business Editor at the Financial Times, and welcome to the first Make UK webinar in the Resetting Manufacturing in a Post-COVID World series, looking at the future of the industrial strategy and societal and economic impact. This is a free-to-view session that will take a deep look at the challenges, but also the opportunities for this key industry, which is at the heart of Britain's industrial strength, both now and more importantly for the future. As the FT reported this week, the government is again considering its industrial strategy, which will set out the roadmap over how and where to put the focus in coming decades. Part of this is a regional levelling up, with talk that this might be around key cities such as Manchester and Birmingham, as well as the Oxford-Cambridge corridor. But this also gives a sense of where some of the priorities might lie. The sorts of buzzwords being bandied around Whitehall these days often include things like deep tech, green tech, life sciences, and AI. But there's a danger, of course, that this is not giving enough emphasis to the traditional British work of making things, be it cars, parts, or defence equipment. These industries employ hundreds of thousands of people and generate billions in economic value, and happen to be key to some of the new Tory Red Wall constituencies. There are clearly two challenges here: how to ensure the short-term protection of key industries through COVID and then Brexit next year, from grants and loans to tax cuts and other ways of helping. And then there is the broader long-term vision of the government, and it felt that Sunak was indicating last week that he was willing to let some companies and some jobs fade away to focus on the more vibrant future of the economy. Away from Westminster, the industry is facing similar questions itself, dealing with short-term survival with an eye on long-term growth by bringing in transformational technologies to provide the new products and services. Which sectors thrive, how companies can adapt, and what this means for policies are the subjects of today, which is an awful lot to talk about. So let's move on to the session. First of all, I'd like to introduce and thank our speakers. We have Stephen Phipson, who's Chief Executive of Make UK, who are our hosts and indeed the voice of UK manufacturing. Phil Hadfield, Country Director of Rockwell Automation, who oversees its products, solutions and services here in the UK. Ruth Nickay, the Executive Director for Purchasing, Commercial, Government Affairs and Legal at McLaren Automotive, and indeed who took part in the Ventilator UK Challenge, which we can perhaps talk about shortly. Rina Ladva, who leads several commercial businesses within Microsoft UK, including manufacturing, utilities, life sciences and built environment. Thierry Mallory, Managing Partner of the Monthly Barometer, a consultancy for private investors and senior managers, and who wrote a book recently on the pandemic, The Great Reset, looking at the great disruption to our society, the economy and the political systems. And lastly, but not least, Jürgen Mayer, the chair of Made Smarter and former chief executive of Siemens UK and foremost industrialist. So first of all, I'd like to again thank all our speakers for being here today and move to our first topic. One of the interesting things about the pandemic, and something that the FT has very been keen to stress, is that it's not been entirely negative. Obviously, it's had a huge impact on everything from the economy to the politics, but there has been positive aspects to this crisis. And the fact that the restraints and the problems of COVID have actually caused an unprecedented acceleration in the adoption of digital technologies. And I want to come to our speakers to give us a few minutes, each of their thoughts on this topic, about which of the major technologies that are now being brought in to change how business in manufacturing operates, be it the buzzwords we can talk about like AI and data and so on, to the more kind of green tech, the energy efficiency stuff, which is becoming so important, or even how remote working has transformed how management works. So there's these big technologies coming through, but also how companies can position themselves for these technological shifts coming through in the next years and decades to come. And so just to kick off, I'd like to ask Stephen as our host to really give us some thoughts to begin with and to frame the conversation. Stephen, can you start off, please?
Thank you, Dan, and it's a great pleasure to be here on this webinar. It's a very important topic. I think I might just frame my remarks around this proposal to refresh the industrial strategy for the country, which is something we're inputting into at the moment. And there is, as you say, quite rightly, a tendency to focus on all of those new technologies, and we are very supportive of that. There's some great opportunities in this country around where we are in the generic green technology space, whether that be hydrogen fuel cell technology, which we can come on to later, carbon capture, well, where we've been with on offshore wind and capitalizing on that success. And there's a lot of interest in government around those sorts of agenda items to go into the new industrial strategy. I think that's important. But I think there are two things, and I think the pandemic experience is one of them, that really we need to bring into sharp focus here. One is around the digitization agenda. I think one of the advantages, as we've all got used to using digital techniques now for communication through the pandemic, and one of the real challenges around manufacturing has been around technology adoption for many of those smaller companies in using digital techniques in their factories and in their processes. And so really this has actually got a lot more people familiar with what's possible to do digitally, and hopefully that's going to help us in our mission to try to convince many of those to get on a digital journey. It's well sponsored by the government. We have the Made Smarter initiative, which you referred to, which Jürgen is heading up, which is vitally important for our sector. We've now got a recognition that the use of digital tools can not only improve productivity, but also contribute substantially to net zero, for example, in making companies more efficient, and really bringing those things to life in a new industrial strategy is something that we're pushing very, very hard. So one advantage of the pandemic has been to heighten that awareness and really make it, really bring it to life, that you can use these in sort of everyday business settings, which is what we're looking at. And we need to dispel lots of those myths about this being incredibly expensive and incredibly complicated for SMEs to get involved in. For a few £100, you can make substantial improvements in your product processes. It's not just about big glass chrome type buildings and very expensive investments. And getting that message out there is going to be the real work over the next year, and we do have government support for that. But the other interesting opportunity we do have, Dan, is we've got tremendous innovation in the UK. In fact, in terms of engineering and manufacturing technologies and product innovation, we're a world leader. There's no doubt about that. The challenge in our country has always been the valley of death, how we scale up those into products. And really a lot of the discussion that's going on around the new industrial strategy is that government's role is to create those conditions that we are able to scale up to full production. And very often what we've seen is fabulous innovative technologies being developed in our country, and then overseas investors coming in and grabbing hold of those technologies and scaling them up in America or in other places. We've got good examples of being able to do that now. The government's got a role to play now in creating those right conditions to make us really successful for the future. And I would really like to see a theme coming out in our new refresh of, I'm not sure it's going to be called industrial strategy, it may be called something else. Knowing this government, we're going to have to relabel it as something else. But certainly on the consultations that are going on so far, that's a strong theme. And I think that would really benefit the manufacturing sector substantially to take advantage of many of these new technologies that are coming through right now and are so important to things like net zero and digitization going forwards. So let me pause there, Dan. That would be my initial comment.
No, well, Stephen, I mean, you talked about so many big topics there we can go back into. But Ruth, I mean, just coming from a position from car making, from McLaren, I mean, just practically, can you bring some to life some of those themes that Stephen is talking about? You know, be it the digital journey, the innovation that you're seeing through your manufacturing processes, and indeed a bit about how you've been this pandemic. So I know you've been involved in the ventilator challenge, haven't you?
We have, yes. And one of, I guess, the challenges and opportunities that the pandemic has brought and the last 6 months have brought is the need for businesses like ourselves, and I think across our industry, to rethink their product planning and their existing business plans. So the fall in volumes, the disappearing, I guess, of cash flow in the very short term has made everybody rethink what we're going to invest in and how we're going to do it. And we see two key areas of technology as being the focus moving forward as we emerge from the pandemic. And they are really in line with the government agendas on net zero. We see decarbonisation of the auto industry and beyond, and also then lightweighting and approach to advanced materials as something that goes very much hand in hand with that. Now, in terms of where we see the opportunities for the UK and for manufacturing. It's exactly as Stephen highlighted. There is a huge amount of innovation already happening within the UK. We have companies like ourselves and others who are actually technology leaders. We're incubators of innovation. But what we also do, and something I don't think we talk about enough within the UK, we also bring those ideas to market. We bring them through the industrialization process and actually put them in products. And it's actually then, as Stephen said, the challenge and where we seem to let ourselves down from a UK perspective is in the scaling up of those opportunities. But we already have this innovation incubator happening within the UK. And I think as organizations such as ourselves and others start moving and pushing, and government starts pushing towards looking at new technologies, we really need to focus on that cradle to grave approach to innovation. So when we look at the likes of decarbonisation, I use that word very deliberately. In the automotive industry, if you read any of the press, it's all about electrification. It's all about batteries and all about how we bring electric vehicles to market. The reality is that electrification is one way of achieving the decarbonisation agenda, but there are many others. There's the use of hydrogen, there's synthetic fuels, and frankly, there are probably technical solutions that we're not talking about yet because they haven't been found. But if you look at what we have already existing in the UK, I'm sure that there is work and activity happening around those developing technologies. And what we need to do, and the opportunity we have now as we emerge from COVID, is really to invest in those new techs with that cradle to grave approach, and really strengthen the UK as a powerhouse of innovation, but also manufacturing, to harness the innovation and see it through to end products. In the context of the lightweighting as well and advanced materials, it's something that we have at the heart of what we do at McLaren. Our cars are very lightweight. It's what we do from our Formula One heritage right the way through to the automotive cars. But the reality is, in the context of trying to make cars more efficient and driving the net zero agenda, we need to make those vehicles lighter. The reality, though, also is in the context of lightweighting that applies cross-sectoral. It's not just limited to what's happening in automotive. It applies to aerospace, it applies to heavy goods vehicles, it actually helps with medical manufacturing, it will actually help with manufacturing processes right the way across a broad number of industries. And one of the opportunities I think we have, again within the UK, with government's assistance, is to start taking that cross-sectoral approach to problem solving and to innovation. You've mentioned, Dan, a couple of times the work we did on the Ventilator Challenge UK. I'm sure it'll come up a couple of times in this conversation. But one of the things I'm most proud about in terms of our involvement in that project, but also the fact that it happened, was that it highlighted the skills and the expertise and the can-do attitude that exists in all of the companies within the UK already. It shows that if we combine forces and work cross-sectorally rather than our little pockets, we can really achieve anything. And I think as we emerge from this pandemic, we hopefully will see an awful lot more collaboration within industries, but also cross-industry with support of government to drive this technology agenda forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It does. It feels like the collaboration element is so important, isn't it now? And Rena, just to come to you, in terms of, Ruth was talking about the technical solutions and adopting these, at pace, basically. But at Microsoft, I mean, what are you seeing as the major sort of push-pull factors for you? I mean, are you seeing your clients, are demanding this now in the way that they perhaps weren't before?
Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating through the pandemic, and particularly in this sector. And I think Stephen and Ruth touched on a number of these areas. I think, a big part of the challenge has been adopting the technologies that we already have. So it's not necessarily just about the new and the best and the greatest. It's about actually how do we adopt what we've got. And Microsoft was very heavily involved in the ventilator challenge as well. And as Ruth said, it was actually how we brought technologies to bear that helped companies that had never actually worked together, that were competitors in the past, to co-collaborate when they'd never even met each other. And I think we calculated that through the ventilator challenge, actually nobody actually met in person. But in terms of sharing all of the materials, having a collaboration platform, and really then being able to take that to the next level and made sure that there's a cultural aspect to that as well. And there's a cultural aspect to this whole transformation journey. And I think particularly in areas like manufacturing, I think there's been a reticence for sure from what I've seen before the pandemic. And as Stephen said, I think that, I don't know if anybody's seen that cartoon where there's a kind of a big kind of bulldozer going through the digital transformation kind of apprehensions that people had. Because now actually things like the ventilator challenge proves that things that people felt they couldn't do quick enough were done very quickly, you know, within 3 to 4 weeks, you know, in terms of getting people together and then producing the ventilators. So really proud of all of that. I think one of the things I'd say on the technology aspect is data, and this actually plays to the point that Ruth talks about. When we talk about technology innovation, transformation, data is at such the heart of everything that can be done. And I think when we talk about collaboration across organizations, how we leverage the data assets that we've all got, and, you know, things like the supply chain, which are critical to things like sustainability, and also, you know, the overall kind of supply chain efficiencies that we need to drive. I think there's definitely more that we can do, and actually the government can support with as well, around having common data platforms, common data mechanisms that, you know, organizations can. Sorry, there was a bit of feedback there. But yeah, and we're seeing more of that. So we are, in terms of what we're hearing from our customers, that there's a bigger focus on data within the organization and getting the data strategy right within organization. But there's also more collaborations. We're seeing things like the Emergent Alliance that Rolls-Royce have stood up to start to think about how we share data across organizations. And I think the final thing I would say is really then how we empower the next generation of skills. And I think, you know, all of the things we're seeing around the next industrial strategy, potentially moving people from one skill set to another, how we use digital, and we're working with a number of customers about not just the deep digital skills, which absolutely need to be built, and, you know, we're working with a lot of the academic organizations, etc., to build the deep digital skills that we need. But actually, it's going back to data, it's leveraging those citizen developers as well. So we're seeing organizations like GSK and BP building an army of citizen developers that can actually manipulate the data in kind of ways that, you know, they don't need the deep technical expertise, but are able to create solutions faster and help drive the digital transformation faster for those organizations as well. So it's really how we straddle both in terms of deep as well as transforming skills of people that are on the factory floor, right through to the accounting departments and, you know, other parts of the organization to really drive the faster pace that we need.
Yeah, there's so much, as Stephen talked about, the digital journey is just, you know, from, you know, as you say, from the factory floor to the office. And Phil, I mean, to come to you on this topic, I mean, what you know, what the major technology shifts are you seeing within, you know, both your business but also your many clients at Rockwell? And I mean, you know, are companies able to get their heads around it at the moment? Clearly 6 months into the pandemic, it's a tough time, isn't it? But at the same time, they need to get do, don't they, for the future?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Dan. I couldn't agree more that the pandemic has really served to emphasise the importance of adopting digital technologies with open standards as a route to achieving greater manufacturing flexibility. I mean, some of the things we've seen, you know, there's the obvious things such as more virtual meetings, such as we're doing today. But from a point of view of our interaction with our customers, we're a lot more remote maintenance and digital modelling are already proving themselves as valuable digital tools to accelerate production and improve the cost efficiency, whilst minimising the human interaction in the workplace. I think the other thing I'd say as well is I think we're at a point now where, you know, for 15 years, 10 or 15 years, companies such as ourselves, automation companies, have been producing smart, intelligent devices that sit on factory floors and can capture data. But I think we're at the point now where I like to think of it as turning that data into information. I think using modern analytics and those skill sets, what we're doing now is contextualizing that data and turning it into real-time strategic information that you know, leaders of organizations can work with and also use up around their ecosystems and around the supply chain. I think all this, though, you know, accelerates the need for training, and I think that's incumbent on all of us, government, employers, universities and schools. I think manufacturers must train employees to be able to leverage the digital future. And the industry must have an ongoing dialogue with academic institutions. You know, as the point that was made earlier, that it's not about specifically deep specialist skills, but about stronger foundations across many different areas to give the skill sets that manufacturers need and really make engineering more appealing and diverse. And that really requires help from the government with funding and resources. And obviously we saw some announcements earlier this week about some initiatives from the government around training, which I think is a step in the right direction. That's fantastic. But I think the other thing I'd say is when we talk about the need for training and education, it's not just about universities. At Rockwell, we get involved with organisations such as primary engineering and STEM ambassador programs, and really that's to promote engineering at a young age in primary schools and secondary schools, to really try and build a diverse future workforce for the manufacturing and engineering sector.
No, absolutely. I mean, can maybe come back to the skills and training bit, because I think obviously crucial for the future. But first, Thierry, I mean, one of the interesting things I think about the book that you wrote is about how disruptive clearly the pandemic has been on many industries and many different economies. But coming to the manufacturing sector, I mean, it's been transformational in 6 months. So coming from your perspective, I mean, what is the disruption here, and where does the industry go next in terms of its technological future?
Right. Well, I'd like to offer, if I may, two thoughts. One is that every single OECD country at the moment, and so all the most advanced economies in the world, are pursuing an industrial strategy or an industrial policy. So everybody does the same, which begs the question of what happens when everybody has the same idea. In a world that is open and in which trade flows naturally, it can be a very good idea. In a world that is retrenching and fragmenting, as it does at the moment, it's hard to anticipate how industrial strategies can pay off, depending on where you are and how you relate to your trading partners. So that's the first thought, and it's already obvious, apparent that technology is being deeply divided between blocks. Now you have, as shown by what's happening with internet, so you might have a Chinese block and an American block, possibly a European block. So a lot of what's going to unfold in terms of industrial strategy will depend on the geopolitical outlook in the world. And the second very simple, basic idea is that when everybody pursues the same thing, which is an industrial policy or strategy, depending on how you name it, well, the law of marginal returns applies very, very quickly. If everybody has the same ideas, the idea ceases to be, to a certain extent, good or effective. So this goes back to the point I was just making about the geopolitical, political outlook, what's happening with industrial strategies or policies in a world that is at risk of retrenching, fragmenting, and to a certain extent, deglobalizing as well. You cannot bring it to an end, deglobalization, but you can put spanners in the work and make it work less effectively, which is what's happening at the moment. So these are my just two thoughts for the moment.
Okay. We'll come back. I mean, in terms of where the UK is in their industrial strategy, I think is an interesting question compared to, say, France or Germany. And Jürgen, I'm going to come to you. Obviously you saw this in a very real sense in Siemens, about how Siemens was placing its bets in different parts of Europe, and partly that must be a reflection of where they see the industrial strategies of these different countries. But also now you're involved with Made Smarter, which is crucial to the UK's future in terms of connecting the dots and bringing together some of the digital technologies. Do you want to take us through the Made Smarter and where thinking is around that at the moment, and also your broader thoughts about where the UK is on its technological digital journey?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. And maybe just building on a couple of the points and then seeing where Made Smarter fits in. So first of all, there is no question, and I agree with Phil and others have commented on it, that COVID has accelerated the need for adoption of digital technologies. However, the implementation of it has taken place largely in light tech areas, I would call them. So, it is sort of web conferencing like this, it is remote monitoring of factories, maybe remote maintenance, as Phil commented, and those sorts of things. In terms of deep tech, so really getting into things, that are more complex, of machine learning, of digital twinning, of factory opportunity. It's the evidence from the Made Smarter implementation, which is helping British manufacturing companies adopt digital technologies is that actually, it's still less than 20% of manufacturers that are really engaging with this deep tech technology. So we have still got a fundamental problem to fix. This is where Made Smarter comes in. Now, the key issue here, to your other question, is that the advantage that we have in Britain, so starting with the positive, is that we're very often the creators of a lot of this tech. We're brilliant innovators and we're way ahead in areas like AI, machine learning. Actually, one I didn't mention is quantum computing, which is, probably 10 years down the road, but people should be getting their head around. So we're great creators, but what we're not very good at is being the integrators of technologies, because very, very few of the time is it just one of these technologies. It's the integration of many of them together. And secondly, we're not brilliant at adopting the technology in an integrated fashion into manufacturing operations. And the way to change that is to have long-termism in terms of approaches to these, in terms of catapults supporting Made Smarter programs supporting these, and secondly, it's scale. So it's scale of joint investment of government and the private sector to really put scale into these activities in order that more people take part and more people get on the journey of adopting these technologies. And on both scale, long-termism, we unfortunately don't score so well here in the UK.
Stephen, what's your view on the long-termism of the ambitions, particularly in government? Because there's two different aspects here, I guess. There's what the government wants to do, and there's what companies can and are willing to do. And to take Westminster, I know where you're sitting. Is the government thinking long term at the moment? Is it sufficiently thinking long term? And are its aspirations actually realistic? Because it's sometimes feels too easy for people to talk about Dominic Cummings' desire to push into deep tech and clean tech and AI and all these sorts of things, and then at the same time we see ARM being sold to an American company. So where do you think the government is at the moment in its thinking, and do you think it's got the bandwidth to really deal with the challenge?
Well, I think my view over successive administrations, not just this one, is that we've not been long-term enough. Manufacturing is a long-term game, Dan, in terms of product development. And, look at the excellent results of McLaren, for example. That's taken years to get to that position. And to encourage that sort of company to be innovative and be successful on a global scale, you need to take a long-term view. It's something we repeatedly keep pushing in government. The fact we've only had an industrial strategy out a couple of years and we're in the process of revising it now, it's a good thing. But again, we're going to be revising some of the longer term aspirations we had in the previous one. So if we're not careful, we are constantly in iteration mode. And there needs to be some stable themes there for the long term, which are investable. They attract overseas investment into our sector and enable manufacturers to really get on a long-term growth path, which is something that's been missing from previous industrial strategy iterations. So there is a theme there. They are listening, Dan. We'll see how it develops. But we are pushing very hard on this being a much more longer term view than we've had before. And on the subject of these new technologies, I think you are right. There's kind of a focus and a concentration of the excitement around AI and all the new digital techniques and technologies. My clear message to government has been that we have to manage both at the same time. In order to develop those sorts of areas of the economy, we also need to transition to them. We need to protect the basic business we have now. We need to encourage it. We need to develop it. There are many, many examples. As we know, there's hundreds of thousands of manufacturing businesses. It's 53% of the exports of the country. You can't just switch from one thing to another overnight. What we need to see is a balance in this to protect and develop our existing manufacturing base, to be able to encourage these new innovative technologies at the same time. And we need to see both. But what we don't want to see is a switch into just a one-dimensional industrial strategy that focuses only on things like AI, important as they are. The other part that's critically important to 2.7 million people in our sector is that we maintain and we grow the existing manufacturing base that we have. So that balance in this, So a combination of a long-term view, some longer-term themes that we need that are investable, and a balance between the exciting new technologies and the existing industrial base is really what we need to see here, Dan. And I think, we'll see how far we get with it, but that's the message that we're pushing with ministers at the moment.
Yeah, interesting. And Phil, I mean, just going to come to you. I mean, from where you sit, I mean, how much is it just getting, as some speaker said earlier, getting to grips with the existing technology and rolling out stuff which is already on the shelf, as opposed to trying to grab the next next dream, the 10-year horizon, whatever it might be. I mean, how do you see it?
So I think the important message for me is is that digitization isn't just for large enterprises, and Stephen alluded to it in his opening statement. I think this can be done in a scalable fashion, by large enterprises, but also by small medium enterprises. I think what's required though to enable that, particularly with the small medium enterprises, is support from the government around research and development and capital investment through loans and grants to mitigate the investment risk. I think the government and industry need to recognise that any company, small or large, can benefit from this infrastructure investment, including things like cybersecurity and things like that. So I think that's important from a small, medium enterprise perspective. When I look at how manufacturers in the UK are performing, I think in the UK we've got a long history of manufacturing innovation, and Ruth mentioned about the ventilator program that McLaren have been involved in is a great example of just how flexible UK manufacturing can be. We've also seen customers of ours who've repurposed lines, for example, to make hand sanitizer instead of whiskey and things like that. So and that all this was done in a very short time scale. And I think initiatives such as Made Smarter, headed by Jürgen, and the industry government strategies show that UK government recognise the importance of the manufacturing sector and the need to generate high productivity and production flexibility by leveraging digitalisation. And I think this can really support the government's green growth agenda and recognition of the importance of low carbon technologies. Ruth touched on electric vehicles and other examples of how we can really capitalise on that, and that sort of innovation and business environment will stimulate engineering innovation and technology in the new business models.
Yeah, indeed. And I want to come to Rena on some of those points, actually, just because looking at the kind of UK manufacturing base, and you talked about collaboration before, but did you get the impression from your work within the Ventilator Challenge and so on that the government was really sort of understood the challenges and the companies were there willing to sort of show the way, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to pick up on that partnership point, actually. I think the Ventilator Challenge showed that when organisations come together and the government's behind it, we can really make a step change on doing something, and that was proved very well. I think programs like Made Smarter and the grants that are out there are fantastic. I think what we probably need to do a better job of is joining forces on some of that as well, because as an organisation, Microsoft is now very, very focused on business outcomes for our customers. In manufacturing, we're talking at board level about what those organisations need to do, both from a sustainability standpoint right through to an innovation and efficiency standpoint as well. And we're making investments ourselves into those organisations. And actually, one of the things I've been working on, and we've been engaging with Made Smarter and the Catapults and Dick Elsey as well, to say, look, how do we bring some of that together? Because if we're investing independently, all of these investments are happening, let's bring it together and make it simple for the organizations to really have that innovation funding. Because as we know, they're kind of in a chicken and egg at the moment. They do need to invest for the future, but their businesses are under massive strain as well. So I think we can do more for sure on that front. And I think the other thing I would say about digital technologies is, and I think, Stephen, you were making the point earlier about new innovation as well as what we need to do for the existing base. And digital can do a lot for driving efficiency. So when we talk about the UK Productivity Index, hasn't shifted from 1% in the last 10 years, digital can have a real impact on that. And we've got some real kind of use cases where that's happened. Unilever have automated some of their factory operations and things, and they've seen a saving of like 2.5 million per factory and 3% increase in productivity. So it's kind of how do we bring those technologies to the organizations to support the efficiencies and immediate gains, but then also, support for future innovation and kind of future technology production and particularly sustainability. When I think about making the link between how digital can really support sustainability goals and, the low carbon goals for organizations, there's a big impact. Digital twins, I think Jürgen mentioned earlier, those are real, they're real, people are using them, but it hasn't got their kind of broad scale adoption yet. And in fact, Dick Elsey and I were having this conversation yesterday about how we think about bringing that more to market and helping people leverage it.
Yeah, the digital twinning is a really interesting technology, and obviously the UK is doing a lot, arguably probably leading Europe in many regards on digital twinning. And Ruth, to come to you, I mean, just in terms of, again, we're talking about short-term, long-term aspect. How easy has it been for McLaren to think about the long term, given all the short-term sort of issues that everyone's had? Every company has had immediate sort of questions over how they just get through to Christmas. At the same time, as a manufacturer, you have to be making bets now, don't you, to think about 10 years time? I mean, how easy is it to find that headspace and to make those bets and to think about the long term?
Easy isn't a word I'd use, but regardless of whether there was a pandemic or not, it would be the challenge, and that's the type of conversation businesses like ours and our industry are always having. Product plans within the automotive industry are quite long, so we do always have one eye on the future. We do always have products in planning. I think, as I said earlier, what the pandemic has done though is really forced us all to put laser focus on what we're planning for the future and look at alternative ways to achieve those goals. The economic shock that all businesses have had over the last number of months, as I've said, has made every pound quite precious. So we really want to make sure that we see results as a result of any money that is invested in products. But one of the areas I think where we as an organization, but also our industry have always been quite forward thinking on and will continue to be forward thinking on is this area of kind of technology innovation. And I think in the context of industrial strategy, I completely agree with Stephen's point that if we start trying to chop and change an industrial strategy, it's kind of missing the point of that longer term need for product planning and future thinking. And, I was quoted a while ago talking about, in one way I'm operating in 2030 at the moment. So even though we're surviving till Christmas, actually the next stage then is, right, what are we doing as an organization in 2025? What are we doing in 2030? And how do we get there? Because the foundations we lay today are actually the enablers to get us to where we need and want to be in the future. And I think from an industrial strategy perspective, it really has to be about allowing innovators to innovate, but allowing industry to guide what that strategy should be. And I know we've always had a very good, positive partnership approach with government and industry in terms of how we build that industrial strategy. But in the context of all of the significant technology changes that are going to come, again, in our area, it's, autonomous driving, it's decarbonisation, all of those things. Having a single approach to how we achieve the ultimate goal in those particular technology environments or the decarbonisation agenda is actually probably going to limit what we can achieve as industries and what we can achieve as a country. So really starting to be brave and broad in terms of what we explore, and government giving support to organisations to kind of take steps in innovation, to have, I guess it's not remove the risk, but enable people to take more risk about exploring new technologies. I think that could be a real game changer for us in moving forward. But certainly in the context of, survival for 2020, actually what this year has been very much about in equal amounts has been about, right, what foundations do we need to lay right now so that we are thriving as we emerge from the pandemic and into the future.
Mm-hmm. Again, I mean, in terms of part of that, debate is how technologies get used and what it means for the future of the workplace to some extent, and the disruption. I mean, because inevitably new technology means disruption, and I think it would be remiss for us to not talk about the fact that this might mean a leaner industry, a leaner set of businesses. It means that some companies are perhaps no longer viable, and that means a cost to jobs. And I think you can see that in what Rishi Sunak was saying last week about sort of, about you can't save everything. I mean, just looking at it from a technological shift perspective, I mean, where does the industry end up in 10 years' time, do you think?
Well, there's no question in my mind at all, and the Made Smarter review researched this quite deeply, and the conclusion was very clear, that the worst thing you can do for jobs is to not embrace the fourth digital industrial revolution. And indeed, every revolution has shown that the more you embrace it, the more jobs you end up creating. Of course, you displace jobs. There's no question about that. But the question is, do you create more jobs than you displace? And then you're back into the argument of how do you create the training and the upskilling requirement for people to move from, doing more manual factory type jobs into those jobs being more, let's call them data-driven programming type of roles, which you have to transition over time. But there is no question that you have to embrace this for the long term. Now, I mean, just to quickly build on the point that Ruth and Stephen were making there, I mean, there is some good news, and that is that, when we transitioned from the second to the third industrial revolution, which was, PC-based automation, PCs, the whole silicon revolution, we did it shockingly in the UK. And the reason was very simple. We decided we didn't really need a manufacturing and an industrial base. We could survive on service industry. And where we are today and the problems we have today in the makeup of our economy is largely a reflection of that bad strategy back then. We're in a better place today in as much as that we now know we do need to be part of the fourth industrial revolution. And as Thierry says, every country knows they needs one. But the trick is, how do you actually do it? And how do you prioritize? And how do you put scale into the areas that you really need to invest in? And that's where at the moment in the UK, we're still a little bit half-baked, and we still need to work out, exactly what that size of the scale, the incentive and the industrial strategy needs to be to really help us create that vibrant fourth industrial revolution, to create the jobs more so than the displacing of them.
Yeah. And Thierry, would you agree that the UK's approach is half-baked at the moment? I mean, what would your initial sort of thoughts be about the prioritization and how for the UK particularly to reach that sort of scale, which it clearly needs to compete with Germany, France, and so on?
Well, it would be just incredibly arrogant for me to make a pronouncement on what UK policy is at the moment. I could just reiterate what I said earlier, and I completely agree with Jürgen. If a country does not embrace wholeheartedly the fourth industrial revolution, it is doomed to fail. Hence the point that an industrial strategy or policy at the moment doesn't give you a competitive advantage per se. It is just, you have to invert the perspective. If you don't do it, you are condemned. You are doomed to fail. You need one. And to a very large extent, the success of such a policy will depend upon other policies, the way in which you relate with your trading partners, the way in which you manage to leverage, harness the power of globalization, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the point is, to a considerable extent, a successful strategy will depend upon exogenous elements such as geopolitical outlook, the economic outlook. I mean, we are at the moment having this conversation in the UK, and no matter what the policy is, the outcome is going to depend considerably on the Brexit outcome, which is an unknown at the moment. We don't know yet how Brexit will take shape over the next few weeks. So, the point is, you cannot consider industrial policies in a silo. They have to relate to the other categories, because in the end, this is what makes the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. It was the first time we mentioned Brexit with manufacturing. It's been at least half an hour, so which is must be a record. So, but Stephen, to come to both that point, but also the broader point, which is that let's not forget the government's put out there £100 billion worth of state funds in loans and guarantees for loans, in some grants, in tax cuts, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the one bit of kind of the big bit of government subsidy, which could have come through with Project Birch, has been largely untouched. It's had one investment in Wales. I mean, do you think and this is a question I suppose to all the panel really, do you think the government should have been more actively involved in supporting the economy over the last 6 months? Because that does play into the industrial strategy clearly, because if you let parts die, then you don't really have much to have a strategy over. So Steve, just quickly, should more public money be directed towards key industries, be it aerospace, automotive, or have they done enough, do you think?
So generally the view, I mean, from our members and the thousands of companies that we talk to, Dan, is that the government's done a very good job, particularly on the job retention scheme. That was something that was very well accepted by many companies, and there's no doubt about it. As a short-term measure, that's been very welcomed by many businesses, as have a number of the other measures. There has been some real challenges around the larger businesses because of the tests that the government put in place to be able to support them, particularly around investment grade credit, which has prevented many of them. You referenced Project Birch, but many of them at the larger end not receiving that same level of support that we've seen their competitor organizations get in overseas markets. So there is that point, which they're very aware of. There's also the point now about where we go from here. And on the discussions at the moment, we've seen the sort of additional short-term measures of the JSS, but there is a real need around recapitalization going on in this country at the moment. There's a lot of companies that have taken on unsustainable debt through the crisis to stay alive. We have got this debate coming up, which is now getting to be quite a public debate about viable versus non-viable companies. But there is a point that there's a very large proportion of companies out there which will not be able to repay those debts. I think current survey numbers that are coming back from the Bank of England indicate something like about 45% of the companies that have taken on government-backed debt are going to struggle to repay that over the next few years. And so when we look at things like the extension on the time frame for the BBLS, and they're good measures, but they're not the whole picture. There's more to do there. Government's very aware of that. So I'm very, very clear that this is not the end of this process. We do compare ourselves very much with our European colleagues, Dan. I think the views that have been taken there, particularly in Germany and France, although there's debates when you talk to French businessmen and German businessmen about the merits of those schemes, the one thing that's in their favor is they're taking a much longer term view than we are. It is very clear from our statistics and our surveys that this recovery, the recovery phase of coming out of the pandemic, is going to take a lot longer than the government first estimated. There's no V-shaped recovery going on here. It is going to take a much longer period than that. I think there's a clear recognition of that in European countries. We haven't quite got that recognition here yet, but it's something we're working on. So I think there's more to come. I think the government's done a very good short-term, it's back to actually the same thing we've had on the industrial strategy, isn't it? We're good at the short-term stuff. Where's the medium to long-term to ensure that these companies, which are mostly viable, I mean, manufacturing is a very competitive sport at the end of the day, and the companies that are manufacturing are 99% of those are viable companies in our sector because they have to be productive and to be in business. So I don't really buy into this in our sector, the viable versus non-viable discussion. What we need to do is create the right medium-term environment for these companies to see their demand come back so they can get back to the right levels of manufacturing. And that's the push we've got at the moment. So good tick in the box for short-term support. A lot of people would welcome those issues. Some struggling at the top end in terms of the requirements for larger companies to be supported, which we've been working on very actively on some of those campaigns with our larger companies. But we do still need to look at recapitalization, the medium to long term now, and get ourselves in a competitive position. We will be competing with France and Germany and similar countries, and we need to make sure we've got a strong manufacturing base to do that for the future, Dan.
Yeah. Well, Ruth, can I come to you next on this? Does the government need to take a more or less sectoral approach to support, do you think? And what sort of things would you like to see the government think about in terms of, I don't know, specifically around car making, perhaps? We've seen today in the BBC, there's a story about a letter being written, basically warning over the car making industry post-Brexit, which is not the first time, it has to be said. Those warnings have been raised before. So Brexit must be on your agenda in a big way at the moment, and how to get through that, initial 6 months or so. So take me through your thinking about support or lack of from the government.
I think I'll just reiterate what Stephen has said, and it's something that we're actually living with on the grind here. The government offered very significant and very, very welcome amounts of support as we went through the initial shock of the global pandemic. But we're not in recovery yet. We're actually emerging from the shock. That's where I see it. And as an industry, the impact of what's just happened is just beginning to be understood. So like most companies, we went through complete replanning, had a look at what the impact of this is going to be on us in the medium term. That in turn will have an impact, and a very severe impact in certain cases, on our supply base. And I think if I was to ask one thing or two things from government, it would be to recognise that we've just gone through the shock phase. We now need, as Stephen has said, to very much align around what that medium to long-term support looks like as we recover as an industry from what's just happened. And that recovery in our books is, optimistically, is 18 months away. There isn't going to be a quick recovery from this. But the second thing that I would really, really implore government to look at is the supply chain. So one of the greatest gifts that we have within the UK is actually the supply base. So yes, companies like ourselves, McLaren, are the big names in terms of the auto industry. But beneath us, we have some really, really, really good suppliers, and they are feeling the effects equally, sometimes more than the bigger OEMs are in terms of what's happened across the pandemic. And if we don't support those suppliers and don't support those SMEs, those real technology leaders in that supply base within the UK, then we're going to see a massive impact on the bigger scale manufacturers and business moving forward. But I think just the question to government for me is what happens next. And I think they've done a good job in supporting the shock period, but we need help to get to recovery, and then need to understand what that recovery period looks like. To me, one of the things that I've become acutely aware of over the last 6 months in a very good way is this viability of our business and our industry within the UK and globally. We genuinely have some really rock solid businesses that will thrive and will grow, and have done in the past, and definitely will in the future. But we really need to almost wrap them in cotton wool now for a little while to make sure that they're given every single support to rebuild and continue to grow as they have been. And I think that's the big challenge that we all face in the medium term.
Yeah. Again, I mean, from where you sit, how worried are you about the where the industry is, and do you think the government's done enough to support it through the last 6 months? But do you think there's also, coming to Brexit, need for the government to do more to wrap the industry in cotton wool through what will be an incredibly disruptive period?
Yeah, so I mean, balancing it slightly, I think the positive is that my experience of the UK manufacturing and the technology industry think that this tough period of COVID, and then you throw Brexit on top of it, and maybe not quite the focus that we need in terms of support from industrial strategy. I think that will actually rally the industry, and I think people will get incredibly passionate and innovative and innovate our way out of this. So it's not all. It's definitely not all doom and gloom, and I think we'll find a way through it. On the other hand, it would be incredibly helpful if, as an antidote to all of this, and especially given that in the UK we've got Brexit on top of everything else, that we just did learn a little bit more from Germany and France, and injected a bit more of that long-termism and the scale of investment. And when you look at industries like hydrogen, electric cars, decarbonisation generally, if you look at the sums of money that have been pumped into the long term, not just the immediate of furlough and all of those good things, then countries like Germany and France are way ahead, and that is giving a bit of a lift. A good shot in the arm of that, and I hope that that's what the industrial strategy, when it's revitalized, will deliver. Yeah,
because I mean that's what. Just to come to, we're coming sadly to the end of the time of the panel, but we would be remiss not to talk quickly, but just a bit about the low carbon, cleaner technologies, which are clearly now just a necessity. They're not a luxury. They're things that companies need to think about. And I think, as Rena, you're talking about the sort of looking for the long term, but companies now need to think about 2030, 2040, and about their clean technologies and about how they're their systems are placed. I mean, how first of all, Rena, take me through your thoughts on this, and indeed, by all means, respond to the rest of the panel from the last couple of comments. But it'd be great to hear your views, and then Phil, and then just to conclude, Thierry, just to give me your thoughts, because I know obviously within your book you talk about the need for a more inclusive and resilient and sustainable world. So, but just to kick off, Rena, can I have some thoughts about how companies can place themselves for that long-term cleaner future?
Yeah, I mean, there's it's certainly a hot topic in terms of what we're hearing from companies. There's a lot of pledges going out there. As Microsoft, we set our stall out in terms of getting clean by 2030 and then actually going carbon negative. And I think a big part of that, and from the pledges and everything else that are out there, it's about how we then get very practical about those things. It's the how. So there's a lot of talk about the what we need to do, but actually the how and the strategies that we need behind that needs to be really, really clear. So, I mean, if I just think about a Microsoft perspective, we've actually got a tax on our internal departments now around the scope 3 emissions that come in. So, that's kind of almost preparing for the regulatory pressures that might come. But how does government again partner with industry to make sure that we're really clear on what the outcomes are that we want to achieve around clean energy, and then what we're actually going to do about that? And as I said earlier, I think digital has a big part to play in that, but I'm not sure that again that's realized enough. And I think Jürgen talked earlier about there's lots of investment, but not necessarily enough examples out there as well of what can be achieved and how it can be done. So for me, and I'll keep it short because I've only got 2 minutes and give other people a chance, but it's really working on a better strategy of transparency and the how we do this for the future.
Phil, and your thoughts on this? I mean, clearly you're right in the thick of things. How's it, from both what you're doing, but also what you're seeing? I mean, how is this working within the industry?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think, we all bear responsibility in addressing climate change, and there isn't a single solution. I think industry has a strong part to play, and reducing waste and scrap has got to be high up on the agenda. Technologies such as digital twins can play an important role here by identifying potential issues on production lines and alter the settings before problems arise. I think the improved management of resources such as water, air, gas, electricity and steam, together with accelerated transition to the use of renewable energy sources such as Jürgen mentioned, hydrogen, will reap huge dividends moving forward, along with the general efficiency and quality improvements that can help energy usage. I think in our new carbon zero future, new opportunities will flow from digitisation, artificial intelligence and software integration. And I believe that's where the next generation of our workforce will transform the way in which industry operates faster than ever before. I mean, we've seen changes, in the last 10 years, unprecedented, and I think that's just going to accelerate. Yeah.
And Thierry, to take those points, I mean, are you hopeful that the society, the industry is heading towards a more sustainable future now?
Yep, you're on mute.
Sorry, my apologies. I am, and while writing the book and doing a lot of research and talking to many global executives, we acquired the conviction that the race not only is on, the race to net zero is not only on, but it's going to be accelerated by the rising activism of the younger generation. It's something that is studied a lot at the moment, and an interesting new phenomenon is the combination of forces between youth activism, not only vis-à-vis climate change, but also the environment at large and equality issues, LGBT rights, etc. But also the way in which youth activism forces are now combining with investor activism. And it's a new phenomenon that is going to accelerate over the coming months and years.
I think that's, well, indeed. I mean, that's the thing. There's so many pushes on this agenda. And actually, Ruth, before I move to wrap up, just give us some thoughts from McLaren about what you guys are doing. And you mentioned like the lightweight frames and so on, but obviously so important for the car making industry, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of our future strategies, we're very much, as I said, focused on the two areas of technology around decarbonisation and then obviously lightweighting. For us, we opened the McLaren Composites Technology Centre in Yorkshire 2 years ago, which will manufacture the carbon fibre chassis for our future cars, which actually is not just about manufacturing, it's about the manufacturing processes and really revolutionising the use of that advanced material. And that did get very good government support. It's actually one of those real examples of how we can start with an idea with the proper support from government and collaboration with education institutions like University of Sheffield, the AMRC and ourselves. You can actually bring an idea right the way through to market. And I think that model is something we really need to expand on more broadly, right the way across all industries in the future. For us as well, the move to decarbonisation is something that is actually going to transform the industry, and it raises a huge amount of challenges and opportunities within that industry. So for us, it's about understanding how we can make the existing technologies either better, because currently the batteries that are available don't work in cars like the one behind me. They're too heavy. They take away all of the driver experience that our customers want. So we've got a technology challenge there in terms of how we make that technology work in the context of our products. But also we're exploring those alternative technologies, the hydrogen, the synthetic fuels, and other potential technologies there. And again, these are the opportunities that I think the broader industry and government need to look at in terms of recovery within the UK and how we grow in the future. All of the ideas are there. We just have to grab them and go for it.
A fantastic place to wrap up. Very aspirational and very inspirational. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to all the speakers. Indeed, we've run slightly over time, but we've tried to cover so much today. You know, from the short-term COVID support packages and the bailout measures the government has had to rush out, and the fact that companies have just been scurrying and so frantically trying to support themselves through this unprecedented period, to the long term, the investment that needs to happen on the company side, the planning that needs to be carried out within Westminster around the industrial strategy and setting out those long-term visions. So important, and clearly a key part of that is the green agenda. So just to conclude, thank you so much to Stephen, Phil, Ruth, Rena, Thierry, and Jürgen for their time this morning. Thank you very much for joining us as well. This is one of, I think, 3 webinars in this series delivered by Make UK with partnership from Rockwell Automation. So I think the next one's set to look more specifically at digitization, and another at trade and globalization. So much more to come from the series. But thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully see you next time.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you, everyone.